Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jericho Perez. I'm on the board of directors for the NHCC, National Hispanic Cannabis Council. I want to welcome you all to our legal committee roundtable. Exciting. We have some super special guests here. We're going to be talking about cannabis compliance. And we know this is a very important part of our industry. Today, I have with me Ileana Jimenez, regulatory analyst with Simplifya, Mauricio Agudello, president of H2O Health Ventures, and Gabriel Mendoza, executive vice president of operations at Forefront Ventures. I'm going to let each of them share a little bit more about themselves, starting with Ileana. Ileana?
Hey, so I'm Ileana Jimenez. I'm a regulatory analyst at Simplifya. I kind of started my career in criminal defense and innocence work before turning to a career in cannabis regulatory compliance. Um, and as a regulatory analyst at Simplifya, I spend a lot of my time reading complex cannabis regulations, kind of dissecting them and then synthesizing them so that cannabis operators, like some of you who might be watching, can use our reg tech to verify that you're operating your business compliantly and kind of keeping up with all of these like numerous state statutes and agency rules.
Thanks, Ileana. Mauricio?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mauricio Agudello, and I'm the president of H2O Health Ventures, an investment company that invests in cannabis-related enterprises. And I'm also a professor of cannabis law at Brooklyn Law School and the University of Connecticut. Before that, I was the CFO of Bedrocan International in Europe and the CFO of Fatmer Life Sciences in South America. And even before that, I was a youthful offender that was caught possessing cannabis when I was 16 years old. And so my history with cannabis is long-standing, and having seen it on practically all sides as an individual who was involved in the criminal justice system, somebody who now teaches and espouses the benefits and necessities of compliance, and an investor. So I'm really happy to join.
Thanks, Mauricio. Glad to have you. And last but not least, Gabriel Mendoza. Gabriel?
Hey, everybody. I am the executive vice president for Forefront Ventures. We're a multi-state cannabis operator with operations in California, Washington, Illinois, Michigan, and Massachusetts. I've been in the cannabis industry now for 8 going on 9 years. Ileana, I started in Illinois, and man, I could have used a synthesized regulatory readout of the Illinois law when I was getting started. I was fortunate enough to apply for and win both a dispensary and a cultivation license back in 2014 when the licenses were coming out for medical in Illinois. In Illinois, I was able to parlay that. I've opened up 14 different dispensaries and 4 different cultivation centers in 7 different states. And I'm really looking forward to be able to give that experience to you today. Compliance is really the holy grail, right? Without a license to operate, you're not going to be in the game, right? And so I have been on the plant touching side for 8 going on 9 years. I also started a nonprofit. It's a local chapter of NORML, which is the National Organization for Marijuana Laws. We started the Chicago chapter, which is where I'm based. And the goal of that was to really educate and motivate communities of color to understand that this cannabis plant is a means for economic, health and wellness, social justice, benefits and issues. And so being able to promote that and provide that to communities of color was something that we found was just lacking. And so we started that in 2016, and we've been really grateful to see the traction that has gained. So really happy to be on here today with you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabriel. And speaking of Illinois, NHCC will be opening up our chapter in Illinois, I think in a week and a half or so. So that's very exciting. Be sure to join if you're in that area. Aside from that, I would be remiss to not say go Nuggets. I'm here in Denver today. But we can get started. Let's talk about the reason we're all here. Excited to talk about cannabis and compliance. I know it's not the sexy stuff that everyone talks about, but we know how important it is, right? Just like the title of this, it's a key to success for all entrepreneurs, especially Hispanic entrepreneurs getting into this industry who may not be familiar with these highly regulated industries, right? So let's talk about that. I want to talk about regulations, right? And for people who are new to this industry, what does cannabis compliance mean? What are they actually complying with?
So first, go ahead, Eliana. I want you to hit this first.
Okay, thank you. So regulations, they come from different agencies, whether it's the state legislature, a city council, or a regulatory agency within a state. And they just require certain actions of people within an industry. So a lot of cannabis regulations tend to focus on security, inventory tracking, and public health and safety, just because of the, highly regulated nature of the industry.
Right.
Yeah. When I think of regulations, I like to bucket them into pre-license regulations, the things that you need to get open, right? And then operational regulations, the things that you need to maintain your license and things that you need to ensure that you continue to do in order to stay in operation. And it's not dissimilar from other different business entities that, operate barbershops or liquor stores, where there are hours of operation, there are security camera requirements that we have, except for with cannabis, it really goes to the nth degree. And I'm sure we're going to get into that. But these are essentially the rules that you need to abide by in order to maintain and keep your license.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure. So what I was going to say is that it's actually quite useful to view regulations. If you just change your mindset a little bit, it's very helpful to view them not as ways to be entrapped, but actually ways to succeed. The government, whether it's a local, state, or other kind of entity, is giving you the questions to the exam. They're telling you how you can be successful if you just follow these rules, and they're very specific. So instead of seeing them as landmines, see them as guardrails to keep you on the proper road to success, and then you won't see them as such a burden.
I think that's a great point. And I want to go back to something Mauricio said. He said it's not necessarily dissimilar to some of the other industries, like alcohol, for example, or a barbershop. However, there are some nuances of being in the cannabis industry that might make it a little more complicated than, let's say, a barbershop. Can one of you talk a little bit about why cannabis might be, well, it's a highly regulated industry, right? But a little bit of the interplay between state, local, and federal, because we all know we're still operating in a federally illegal space, right? So can one of you, and maybe that's you, Mauricio, talk a little bit about why the cannabis industry compliance is so important?
Yeah, it's, so the way that I generally tend to think about it when I teach compliance as part of the curriculum in a legal context is that really we're trying to negotiate a truce between federal illegality and state permissions. And the way that we do that, if we want to talk about like the organizing principles, you start with the various enforcement memoranda that were articulated by the Obama era Justice Department and communicated to the public through the various memos, specifically like the Cole memo. And so there they lay out the theory, the philosophy. What are we trying to accomplish and what are we trying to prevent? Right? We're trying to accomplish an organized, efficient, and effective state commerce that doesn't interfere with federal interest in proscribing a controlled substance. So once you have that in your mind, then the rest of it starts to make sense. Like, what am I trying to prevent? I'm trying to prevent diversion. What are we trying to withhold and forestall? We're trying to withhold and forestall the use of cannabis products by children or the engagement of international criminal enterprises. So once you've got all of those things, the philosophies, then everything else is essentially an organized subset of those principles, right? We want compliance because we want to have a predictive and preventative and proactive system in place for a consumer product. In the end, this is something that is consumed by individuals, smoked, orally, topically, whatever it is. And so we want people to follow regulations to ensure that they are receiving products that are compliant with their corporate regulations, with state regulations. And so thinking about the ideas behind why we have these regulations and state laws always helps to change the framework, the narrative, right? And again, what I said earlier, if you view it as a sneak peek at the test, getting the questions ahead of time, then you don't see it as an adversarial process. Then you see it actually as a guiding principle, as a lodestar that helps you to organize your affairs so that you mitigate the long tail risk of non-compliance.
Right. All great points. And I think that is so logical and so reasonable. I do think, we all need to realize too, that while we've made so much progress in the cannabis industry, we're still, not every state it's legal, right? There's still the states that are only medical, right? And we are still in an age where a lot of the regulators we're working with are not so progressive, not so reasonable. And that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. And I like to think, we're going to see something different in New York. The culture's finally changing here in Colorado, but we are working. A lot of our regulators are previous law enforcement officers, right? But still, Marisa, you talked about these ideals, right? What's the purpose here? This is a consumer product, right? We don't want this in the hands of kids. We want it to be tracked. So, Ileana, Mauricio, everyone, let's talk a little bit more about what are the most important things that regulators care about? What are the bulk of these regulations and requirements focused on?
First and foremost, for us at least, it's inventory tracking, right? I mean, you have to be able to, in the states that we operate in, namely Massachusetts and Illinois, especially inside of these regulations, it requires that every single day you do a physical count of every piece of inventory that you have inside of your vaults, inside of the retail stores. And so the goal here is, and like you said, right, that the individuals who created these laws initially were heavily influenced by law enforcement, were heavily influenced by constituents who were really afraid that you were going to be letting in some sort of menace into your backyard that was going to proliferate illegal drugs and ruin your neighborhoods. And so because of that, there were these regulations, compliance regulations that were put in place in order to ensure that doesn't happen. So for example, every single day we have to count our inventory. We cannot open any dispensary if we don't have cameras that are operating, if we don't have a point of sale system that is functional. And in Illinois specifically, if we don't have third-party security on the premises, right? And so all of those really are focused around diversion, are focused around ensuring that the product that you have is maintained within your four walls. And it's amazing that, when you put these rules into play at the beginning of any sort of legal cannabis industry in any state, you might think, man, we have to do this every single day. In what other industry is there zero slippage? In what other industry is there not something that gets scanned twice and accidentally overrang? And it's amazing to me how close we are to zero slippage because of these regulations. And yes, they're onerous, but ultimately they're geared toward ensuring that there is some sort of semblance of safety. And I saw when you ask what are the most important ones, it really is ensuring that there's no diversion. We have regulators that come in that are disguised as folks with bad IDs, right? They'll come in, they will have an ID that's young or an ID that's fake, or a piece of documentation that isn't correct. And I mean, we have a stack of IDs that are just this high from folks that are either trying to get in with a fake ID or something along those lines, and they'll fine you. And so the regulators are really focused on making sure that you're not diverting this to minors and that you're not selling it out the back door to the black market.
Right. So, you said a word there that's, I think, really tying this all together, and that's safety, right? Public safety. It seems like really all of these regulations, the whole purpose is public safety, whether it be for the consumer, children, non-consumers who are the public. Ileana, talk to me a little bit more about public health and safety, and maybe break down a little bit these sort of categories of regulations we see from an objective standpoint, being that you are not necessarily an operator. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think Gabe and Mauricio touched on this quite a bit, but everything kind of falls under that umbrella of public health and safety. So inventory tracking, making sure you know where all of your inventory is at all times. Sanitation and quality assurance are some other big ones, especially in terms of your manufacturing processes. So you want to have adequate control of those processes and just making sure you're putting out quality products and like checking the purity of them and everything. Security is a big one, especially within, kind of how the cannabis industry is. Robbery and crime are like very real security risks, especially in cash only establishments. So just making sure that your security protocols are good so that you're keeping all of your employees safe, your business safe. And then like if you have neighboring businesses or I don't know, children or homes nearby, which is usually not allowed per zoning laws, but I won't get into that. Just making sure you're protecting everyone that's associated with your business. And then they kind of talked about sales to minors. So controlling the access to your facility, making sure you're checking these IDs and you're not selling to minors, making sure that you're knowing the legal adult use and medical purchase and possession limits so there isn't any diversion. But yeah, those are kind of some of the big public health and safety risks that we see.
And I think that there's something that, and this isn't on the retail side, but as being a cultivator as well, forefront being a cultivator as well, having the right dosage on your labels, right? I mean, there was a case in Florida where a company, I won't name the company, but Google it, but they mislabeled their CBD tincture as THC tincture as CBD, and an elderly individual who was using a high dose of CBD took too much and actually they had a heart attack and they died. And so the public safety when it comes to labeling your products correctly is really important, because you don't want someone to, this is a consumable, right? I mean, and it is not, it can be very intense, right? I mean, if you have a high dose of THC and you're not prepared for that, there can be very serious adverse effects. So even public safety in regards to how your product is labeled is extremely important.
That's a great point, Gabriel. We talked about the adverse effects that could obviously happen to a consumer, and that did happen to that consumer, which is just absolutely terrible. But if you're not complying with these things, there's going to be serious adverse effects on your business as well. I'd love for you guys to talk a little bit about what the repercussions for companies look like that are not compliant, whether it be their first strike or their second strike, or God forbid, their third strike. And Mauricio, I think you could probably speak to this. Gabriel, you as well, being an operator. So let's talk a little bit about that. What does it look like when you are not compliant?
Sure. And one of the things that I wanted to note on the last subject, the way that I generally tend to look at compliance regulations, the things that you have to do, is through two lenses. It's either stasis or crisis. What do you have to do when you are operating, complying in the ordinary course? And what do you do when something goes wrong, right? So if you're in the ordinary course, then compliance is a good way to establish corporate hygiene, to figure out your best practices, to lever them between departments and operations, and to really become as effective and efficient as you can. Right? It becomes an indemnity against operating in crisis. When you're operating in crisis, you have uncertainty, you have mystery, you have a challenge to your corporate existence, your corporate culture, your identity as an operator or distributor. And so what you're ultimately trying to do is to expedite recovery in crisis, to create trust in stasis, and to do it as a competitive advantage in order to be better than your competitors, as good as your highest peer, And so now getting to the question that you asked, what happens if you fall out of it? Well, the clear and most, abrasive issue is that your license is in jeopardy, right? You might be required to pass more frequent and more intense reviews. You may have your license rescinded. You may be placed on a list that suggests that you can no longer operate in this industry because you've been negligent in some capacity, right? Because you've breached the expectations of trust from the federal government to not engage in those behaviors that have been identified as policy, but then more specifically, you've breached the specific regulations from your state. The expectations that they laid out for your stasis, you have not complied with, and you haven't resolved your ability to operate through crisis. And so, whether or not it's a revocation of license or forestalling yourself from continuing in this industry, I think that there are grades that are as severe or lower, but in the end, you just don't want to be on the bad side of your regulator. It's just never a good idea. You always want to be close to them. You want to self-report if anything goes wrong, because you will always get the benefit of a doubt. If you self-report, you might evade some fines or penalties or other censures. But if somebody has to find out that you're misbehaving and then investigate and conclude that you possibly even can engage in some kind of cover-up, it doesn't end well with you, and it usually ends with double or treble damages.
Yeah, I think that, and it took me a while to really realize this. And to Mauricio's point, the regulators aren't there to gotcha, hey, they're not trying to mess with you. They really are. If without you, they don't have a job. Right. And so it took me a while to realize that this is something, especially with, being in cannabis for longer than it was legal, you've got a side eye to regulators, right? But they really, really absolutely are your friend, and you need to be able to use them. You need to be confident in their trust that you're doing the right thing. And in order to do that, you have to be honest and open with them. And we have seen, for the most part, there are very few things that are going to result in your license being taken away. That is really when you are being negligent, when you are continuously ignoring the advice of and the regulations of the given state that you're in, or the given police department that you're in. But there are things that, and if you are in the Maryland cannabis industry, you will know that just this week, the cookie store in Baltimore got shut down because they were completely, the regulators came in the day before they were set to open and said, hey, you need to do this, that, and the other, right, in order to be open. They did not comply with that. They just opened their doors. And then on top of that, they had one of those big smoke guns that they were blowing smoke into people's faces in the line, and that was on camera. And they said, hey, we need to see your video camera footage. And they said, we don't have any video camera footage. And so they shut them down, right? And so you can't, you have to work in collaboration with them, right? And so yes, there are instances where you can get temporarily shut down, or you can have your license pulled. It's very rare. Most of the time it's fines, and it depends on the state that you're in. And those fines, it can vary, right? It depends on the severity and the frequency of that. But yes, it runs the gamut. And the reality is, the sanctity of the license, I said this before, is the most important thing. As an operator, you cannot operate without a license, and then the value of your company is zero, right? So it's extremely important to ensure that you are playing well with your regulators, and that you're not brushing them off as just, don't worry, they're going to get over it. You really want to respond to them whenever it is that they're asking for something.
Right. And kind of going back to Mauricio said, there's the, cost of maintaining compliance and the cost of what happens when you fall out of compliance, right? And I think an important point to make here is, in the end, 99% of the time, it's so much cheaper to just start compliantly than it is to fall out of compliance and then pay for that. Here in Colorado, one thing we're seeing is that the regulators are understaffed, right? So 2 years ago, Colorado was a totally different industry than it is right now. We've really had a downturn here. And we had clients who were operating 2-3 years ago, and we're just now seeing enforcement actions for things that they were doing then. And a regulator visited, said, oh, whatever, it's all fine. We did this investigation. Don't worry about it. They've had 2 renewals since then. And we're just now seeing complaints for these violations and tens of $1,000s in fines. And with the industry like it is right now, that's a huge problem for operators. I mean, they can't pay the fines. They just physically can't do it. So, some of these fines might be $5,000 and maybe that's not a big deal, but we do see fines into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's so important to start compliantly than it is to try and remediate non-compliance after the fact. So let's talk about how companies do maintain compliance, how to start compliant operations. Some of these regulations are really complicated. When we're talking about testing, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but these things are so complicated. We're talking about testing and getting into the weeds with all of this labeling. What are companies doing? What can they do to maintain compliance? Ileana, this might be a great place for you to chime in.
Yeah, so a big thing is just instilling a culture of compliance top down from your CEO to your frontline minimum wage employee, just teaching people the importance of, following these laws. And, I work for Simplifya. We have RegTech that kind of helps cannabis operators, check these regulations via audit content or standard operating procedures or packaging and labeling checklists. So just like making sure that your employees are actually running those audits, doing things internally. So just kind of running internal audits, finding those gaps, addressing those gaps, and then you're prepared for when a regulator comes and you're like, I've already done this. I know that I'm doing things the right way. If you have the resources, hiring legal counsel and having a dedicated compliance team, that's great. Again, it's not always necessary, especially if you have a compliance tool, kind of like what Simplifya offers. Thoroughly understanding the laws that apply to your business, what you need to do to follow them, and then the consequences of not following them. Maintaining and following an operations plan and standard operating procedures, and then training your employees on all of that. And then just having good documentation practices also really helps. So you have a paper trail for everything that's going on in your business. But those are kind of some small things, at least from my side, that I see, but maybe Gabe and Mauricio can speak a little more directly.
I think it depends on the size of your business first and foremost, right? When I started and won those licenses in Illinois, it was me and my CEO. There was no one else to read the regulations. So, depending on your size, someone has to read the regulations. And you can't just read them. You have to put them into a software like Simplifya that will allow you to adhere to those. And then, one of the big things that we do when you open a store, there is a wide swath of checklist items that you need to have. Things down to the counter height and the counter width, right? The bathroom ADA requirements, the amount of the frames per second of your cameras, right? So those things aren't things that you're just going to be able to read one time and be able to remember. Those things are things that you need to read and then properly document so that when you are going through this process, you can check the box, so to speak, and get that license for yourself or maintain compliance. And the bigger you get, you absolutely do need individuals in compliance. And especially, on the production side, compliance it takes a whole nother level outside of just checking the box to make sure you have the proper counter height, but ensuring that you are complying with that your recipes are that they're properly dosed, right? To ensure that any sort of anything that you're spraying or putting on your plants is going to be adhering to the law. We've got a in Illinois specifically, where I'm based out of, the testing is extremely onerous, right? The parts per million it's so low. It is very difficult to, if you have a humid day and your HVAC is out, that your crop might not be able to pass, right? And so when you're thinking of if any of you are new operators or entering into new markets and want to be operators, following and adhering to some of these regulations is going to be more costly than some other ones, right? You need to ensure that you have the proper HVAC, because if not, you're going to run into a scenario where your entire crop is going to be lost. And to all of our points, right, it's tough out there right now, and so you cannot be failing entire crops and expect to continue to be operational and successful. So it depends on the size of your company, right? If it's just you and someone else right now, you're looking to apply, or you've already applied and you've just won, I encourage you to just sit down, read the regulations, work with your regulators, right? I mean, a lot of them are stretched, but if you can get in really good with a regulator, it's going to be really helpful for you to be able to ask them questions that might seem confusing to you, but are a lot more well versed in. So it depends on where you're at. But bottom line is, someone has to read those rules and someone has to hold you accountable. And if it's you, it's you.
Yeah, one of the things that Ileana pointed out too, that this has to start from the top, is that at one of the former companies where I was a CFO, we had a slightly cheeky mission statement that said that we were a compliance company that happened to sell cannabis. And it's kind of, you don't always live up to it, but when you think about it, it's essentially what you do. You do all these things, you follow these steps, and at the end, you get to sell cannabis, rather than the other way around, that you have cannabis that you have to sell and you're thinking about your prices and how you market it and what it looks like and the colors on it. Those are great things, but you have to engage in these steps before you get to the sale. And so another point that I heard Jericho mention that I think is absolutely has to be emphasized, restated, and then printed just everywhere throughout your organization, is that reverse engineering compliance is at best twice as expensive as just following the right path the first time, at best, because you'll have to do it twice. And if you don't do it right, you might have to do it a third or fourth time, whatever it is, whatever the issues that you fall out of compliance with. Not doing them right the first time isn't like, throwing your dirty laundry under your bed. It doesn't go away. It grows. It becomes endemic. It becomes contagious to the rest of your organization. So without that non-compliant thought metastasizing, you have to isolate, you have to address, and you have to go at it at the source and in real time. Otherwise, it becomes endemic throughout your organization, and it's very difficult to recover from that.
Right. And I think, one thing that I think all of you have talked about, and I know Gabriel was talking about, is the importance of these processes and putting these things in writing and actually understanding them. I know one thing that has been so helpful for our clients, and not all states require this. And when you're new to an industry, you may not have the expertise creating these things, but actually putting together, before you start operating, standard operating procedures. I'm talking step by step. This is how we're going to make a sale. This is how we're going to check out a customer. Those things, this is how we're going to harvest. This is how we're going to test. Putting those things in writing and actually citing your regulations within those standard operating procedures, training your employees on those procedures, and therefore training them on compliance with the regulations, can make such a huge difference in starting compliantly and then maintaining compliance. And not just that, but you're probably going to get, in a lot of states, at least a yearly compliance visit from your regulators, right? I won't call it an investigation. Maybe it's an inspection, a renewal inspection. But having these things in writing and saying, hey, regulator, I have this beautiful binder, and we call them compliance binders, or your standard operating procedure binder, that will walk you through everything we do all of the regulations we're meeting. And as we walk through our facility, you know what, we'll just go page by page and look at this. And that can make a huge difference, guys. So I think that's something that's really important. And you don't necessarily need legal counsel to do that. I know that's something I think Simplifya provides as well, right, Ileana?
Yeah, so we have lawyers who are constantly tracking and reviewing regulations for different states, and then dedicated teams of experts per state who just kind of follow everything that happens in each state.
Right. So whether it be using Simplifya or working with regulators, you know, I know, I think, Gabriel, you were talking about making friends with your regulators makes a huge difference, right? So when they actually do come for that inspection, you're, hey, Tom, we talked about this. We talked about this. So glad to see you. That can make a huge difference. A culture of understanding, a culture of collaboration. And then, you know, as an attorney, I have to say, anytime you're asking questions, I love that you might be able to make a phone call to your regulator. That's great. I understand there's value in that. But always put it in writing, because these rules are complicated. Some regulators, and some of them are very broad, very vague, right? One regulator may have a totally different interpretation than another that comes to visit you next year. So putting those, any communications you're having with regulators, even just casually following up and saying, hey, Tom, we talked about X, you said X. This is my understanding. No need to reply unless my understanding is incorrect. Just following up in writing like that can really down the line help you understand what regulators want from you. And if there's ever an issue, saying, well, I was actually following the guidance you gave me. So that's something from experience I've seen with clients I would strongly recommend. Any other hot tips like that you guys have, whether it be, you know, when you're communicating with regulators, or let's say you're having an inspection, little things that you guys could share with stakeholders that may be helpful for them?
I have a couple anecdotes to what you said, Jericho. The first one is putting it in writing for your regulator. So when you guys get inspected, there's going to be, it depends on, you know, the staffing levels, if you're going to see the same person from one year to the next, or from one inspection to the next. And so, for example, we have a dispensary, and we have essentially what's like it's like a pass through. So it's a pretty large pass through from the back of house, like day storage, if you will, to the floor. And when we were going about the process of opening that dispensary, we got it in writing that this was acceptable, that this pass through was acceptable, because, you know, someone's like, oh, you could theoretically sneak someone through there or something like that. And when the inspectors came, we got that in writing from the head of the regulatory agency. When the inspectors came, the first thing they did is they pointed at that thing and they said, no, you're going to have to fill that in. There's no way you're going to, that's acceptable. And we said, hey, we actually have this in writing from the head of your department. And they said, okay, right. And so that would have cost us tens of thousands of dollars to refix that. So getting things in writing is really important. Also, we have the compliance binders, right? So it's got all of our SOPs, and the SOPs that you use for your regulatory inspections are essentially going to be really a regurgitation of what the laws and the regulations are, right? It's going to say, and you are going, because you're going to be adhering to it, but it is going to say all of the things that are in the laws and the regulation, so that when an inspector comes, they can say, okay, these individuals are following that. So there's definitely a benefit to having SOPs to do the day-to-day stuff, but it depends on whether the day-to-day is required by state law. That can be in a different binder than if then what the SOPs that you need to adhere to in order to actually operate from a regulatory perspective. So those two things I just wanted to hammer home really do work. You want your regulator to come in during an inspection and know that you are always compliant, because that makes the inspection a lot more easy. They're not taking their sweet time trying to find ways to mess with you. You are that beacon of good standing, and because of that, you are given the benefit of the doubt. And I have regulators that when I first started, still calling me today, talking to me about things that they've seen or checking in. You want that kind of relationship, because you gain that trust and your company gains that trust. And that's really helpful in terms of like Mauricio said, there's a lot that goes on. Compliance is one huge aspect, but you've got to run a business, right? So if you're concerned and trying to get these things for regulators because they spent 8 hours at your facility and now you have a laundry list of items that you need to provide to them, it takes away from operational efficiency. It takes away from customer service. And so I would just want to hammer those two home.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Business interruption is something that you never think about it, and it will become an issue at some point. The one part about compliance that should invoke participation and a measure of seriousness to it is that you are going to fail in some capacity. You are going to breach some rule, some regulation, some law. It happens everywhere, all the time. Every business in every state all the time is in breach of something. The difference between that business and your business is, number one, that it's yours, but number two, that because it's cannabis, we have an additional level of scrutiny on us. And so you will fail. You hope that your failures are small rather than big. And then when you fail, that you can petition the benefit of a doubt by your regulator, because that's all you really have. If they want to scrutinize you, they can scrutinize you to the point of becoming either a legitimate interruption to your business, or they can be a partner. And that's up to you. That's how you treat them, how you take their calls, how responsive you are to their requests, how accommodating you are if and when they visit. So don't question yourself as to whether or not you will ever need to face compliance concerns, because you will. Don't question whether or not you will fall out of compliance, because you will. The only thing that you can do is plan ahead for how you cure and the relationship you have to that process, how quickly you get on it, how effective you are at changing, re-engineering, and modifying the things that are out of compliance, and then ultimately, what you do to the person that oversees that regulation. And so if you treat them like a jerk, they're going to treat you like a jerk. If you ignore these requirements, they will build and they will grow and they will eventually take you down. So don't do any of the things that you shouldn't be doing, and then you'll have a profitable business.
Absolutely. One thing I think is interesting is, you said, Mauricio, don't do anything you shouldn't be doing. In my experience working with operators, and I do most of our administrative law for Colorado here in our Colorado practice, and that means I work with clients after they have fallen out of compliance and they have gotten in trouble with regulators. We have a compliance department who is, hopefully putting them on the right track before that happens. But I'm in usually crisis mode when clients come to us. And I want to talk a little bit about the most common violations I see are things that are so simple. They're not these major things where an operator is being intentionally mischievous. They're not malicious violations. They're little things that turn into big things that you may be doing in your operations every day. And I'll start those with saying inventory tracking. We've talked about doing all this inventory reconciliation, plant tagging on the cultivator level. Most states say you have to actually attach a tag to the plant when it is, let's say, 8 inches or whatever that state's requirement is. And people just aren't doing it, and yes, it starts at the top, but they're not going into the facility every day and making sure plants are tagged, and it's little things, and 200 veg plants haven't been tagged, right? So those are the most common violations I'm seeing. Probably starting with inventory tracking is tagging. And then I would say number 2 is record keeping. Little thing, again, but you don't have a printed out, like a fire alarm map, right? Or maybe you haven't updated your floor plan with the regulating agency. You submitted it with your renewal, but you never printed it out and stuck it on your wall. And that's required. So it's little things like that putting together these checklists, such an easy thing to get done. And when those things add up, usually I'm seeing these complaints from a state with like 50 little bitty things like that. that add up into a $50,000 fine, $100,000 fine, which is just absolutely ridiculous. But they're coming in for inspections once a year. And at the end of year 2, we've got a 50-item list. That's huge. So I don't know if you guys have experience with, what the most common violations that you're seeing, but I will say most of mine are those things, and then cameras. So it's such a simple thing, you would think, but checking your cameras every day, making sure they're all working, making sure you've got your 30 days or your 60 days, whatever it may be. That most regulators have a checklist that they're going through. And a lot of times, if you have a great relationship with your regulator, you can ask for one and they'll share one with you. You could also do a public records request and get it. But they're going through a checklist. Cameras are always going to be on there. So that's another super simple area where doing a weekly check, love a daily check, but at least a weekly check to make sure everything's running properly can make a huge difference. So I don't know if you guys have other experience with what the most common issues you're seeing are and the easiest way to rectify those. But if so, please do share.
I think it goes to, like you're saying, top down. So I can't be in all the dispensaries at one time, and nor should we expect to, right? As leaders, it's important for your leadership to understand the importance of making sure you have the proper regulations and you're adhering to the proper regulations. The one that we see a lot is there's one that we see all the time. It's signing people out. It's signing people. So for visitors, most dispensaries need to have a visitor log, not for your customers, but for, say, a vendor comes in to do a pop-up or a handyman comes in to fix something. You have to sign them in and out. And so if the inspector comes in and you've signed them in, but you haven't signed them out, they start to add those up, right? And so if you have 10 of those, when they come, that's going to add up. Another one is expired IDs, right? You can't have anyone who's working with expired credentials. And that comes down to, do you have the right team? Does your team know if it is, the responsibility of your management team at the store? Are they accurately checking those dates? And are you making sure that you're paying the proper the fees and that you're getting those IDs in a timely fashion? Those are the two biggest ones that we see at the retail level. It's just, and of course, cameras. I mean, when we first started, like putting camera footage on the cloud wasn't as prevalent. And so we had to pay like 80 grand to have 90 days in Illinois. It's 90 days of storage. It's like 90 days, but yeah, 90 days of storage. And that is a lot of information. And so what happens is, you can have days that will start to get lost. You might have started with 90, but then it goes to 89, then 88. And if no one's checking that, you could have lost 4 or 5 days, and you have to adhere to those, right? And in Illinois, it has to be continuous video footage. So if the inspector in our grow facilities, we have an inspection every week. Everyone in Illinois has an inspection once a week, and the inspector goes in and he looks at your cameras and he says, show me 2 a.m. front door camera. And if for some reason it is not showing, that's another one. And so making sure that you have the right hardware and software to be able to adhere to these is sometimes really costly. And so the ones that we really see, cameras, visitor badges, visitor sign in, sign out, and then agent renewals.
Got it. Yeah, and I want, something I want to bring up too is just for those of you who are new to the industry, or maybe those of you who have a perfect compliance record and haven't gotten in trouble yet, there's always this state and local component. So if you're getting in trouble at the state level or you're getting in trouble at the local level, you're usually going to be required to report those issues and violations to that other agency. So if it's state, you're required to report it to local. You may be required to report it to other states you're licensed in. So that's something to be aware of too. You could be receiving discipline from both the state and the local level if a state investigator comes in, because usually those state rules are just incorporated into the local rules. So if you're violating it at the state level, you're violating it at the local level. And then we don't want that to happen. So that's something to be aware of. It's not just the state regulators. Work with your local regulators too. It's not just your marijuana regulators. It's also, your excise and license, whoever's controlling your tax and license fee payments. It's also going to be planning, zoning, planning and development, right? Those are all really important pieces of compliance too that we may not necessarily think about when we're talking specifically about cannabis, but those are very important. Any other things you guys can think of like that, things in cannabis compliance that may not necessarily be cannabis focused, but, I know paying taxes is something that can get really complicated for a lot of companies. And Mauricio or Gabriel, I don't know if you guys have any advice there, but making sure that's done and done it correctly is so important.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry,
you
go
need
ahead.
to have certificates to. I'll just be quick. You've got to pay your taxes in order to be a you have to pay your local taxes in order to get a certificate of good standing, in order to operate your license. And one thing that, and this is not tax related, but it is what you talked about earlier, Jericho. And it took me, and it's probably not this way anymore because how prevalent, regulated cannabis is now. But when I first started in Illinois, it was really like the first limited license state. And it was the first state that I operated in. And so it took me a while to really understand the dichotomy between your local regulatory body and its rules and regulations and the state rules and regulations. And so when I got the permit to operate, I was like, this is great. And then I realized, oh my gosh, there is a whole local zoning ordinance that I have to abide by. And that is going to cost tens of thousands of dollars if you're in a big city like Chicago, and it's going to cost time. And so I really want, hopefully, I just want people not to do the same things that I did, to learn from this, right? And so there's the local regulatory body that you need to adhere to, your local municipality, township, city, whatever that is. And then there's the state level. So be aware that there are two different types of that.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on something that Gabriel was talking about before and that Jericho raised, which was most of the things that you will do to fall out of compliance, you will kind of do to yourself, is unfortunately the truth. The foot faults and false starts that you will engage isn't because of some greater conspiracy or larger complication. You'll just end up forgetting to close a door. You'll forget to dispose of your waste correctly. You will forget things in the ordinary course that are not, that you could be the absolute image of compliance, and you will just forget to lock the door, right? You will do these things because you have 100 others on your mind. And so a little bit of forgiveness, a little bit of foresight are always important. And when and if you are noted for them, you accept it. You go, yep, you're right. You're right. It's totally nobody else's fault but mine. I did it. I will ensure that it doesn't happen again. And then you learn from it. So touching on the additional question of financial complexity, there's unless you are essentially a tax lawyer or CPA, this is something that you should outsource. This is absolutely something that you shouldn't try to calculate yourself. I've got all the experience in the world in finance and running companies, and I didn't do it myself because the risk of getting it wrong is not worth the cost of bringing in a professional. And I could always spot check it. I could audit. I could understand what was going on and how to calculate things. And when things were out of joint, when they were out of sorts, but I never wanted to be the first authority on whether or not I had paid all local and state taxes, licenses, and fees. It just doesn't, no matter what you think you're saving, you will get that wrong. And you will wish that you had paid the $5,000 or the $10,000, because at that point you're looking at having to reissue statements, having to recalculate things. And the goal of compliance is to mitigate business interruption. That's the goal. That's the reason that we engage in all this. So you can get back to your core business, but the less that you do to comply, the more time you're going to have to spend in compliance. It's like an inverse relationship that plays out everywhere at all times. So know the things that you're good at, outsource those subjects and disciplines that you don't have experience or that you're you don't exactly love doing, and then just consider it part of the cost of doing business, because that's what it is. And so those are kind of vague but hopefully useful mechanisms by which to view these small and the large things. The large things, don't do them if you don't know how to do them. The small things, you'll get them wrong, but you can fix it.
Right. Well, lucky for everyone on the call and for us, we do have Ileana on, who works with Simplifya, who is the perfect place to outsource some of these compliance things to the compliance professionals. Ileana, as we're wrapping up the hour, can you tell us a little bit about what solutions Simplifya actually offers cannabis small businesses? And I know you guys aren't the only ones in the space, but what are these simple solutions that you can outsource?
Yeah, totally. Well, for starters, we do offer a discount for social equity licensees. And if you have insurance, we have our RMA, which is a risk mitigation alliance, and they might help pay for part of our technology. But our core product has 5 main components to it. So we have audit content, standard operating procedures, record storage, packaging and labeling checklist, and then a license tracker. And all of these core products come with clickable citations. So you can see where we're getting the information from, whether it's the state statutes or different regulatory agencies. So you can kind of see where everything's coming from. But our audit content, we kind of break down these regulations to a 12th grade reading level. And as someone on our client engagement team kind of explained to me, you can choose whether you want to do a root canal or a cavity fill. So the root canal is obviously a full audit. So you go through every category and make sure that like your entire business is operating the way that it should. Or you can do a cavity fill. So you can pick a single category and just focus on security if you're not worried about advertising or if you don't do advertising. And then at the end of those audits, you'll get an audit report and a remediation report. And the audit report is everything that was in the audit, and the remediation report is just the questions that you answered non-compliantly. And we give you action items to kind of help you figure out, how do I bring myself into compliance? So we give you those steps, and you can actually assign those out to different people within your business. And so you can see like who did what and when they did it. As far as our standard operating procedures, kind of is what it sounds like. We offer them state specific and operation specific, and they're also customizable. We also include best practices in our standard operating procedures to help you go above and beyond. And so you can kind of wow those regulators whenever they come through. Our record storage, or what we call our smart cabinet, is just, online record storage. You can house any documents that are related to your business. That includes the SOPs, the audit reports, remediation reports, your licenses, your application renewals, your security plan, you name it. If it's a document, you can store it in there. Then our packaging and labeling checklist, they're organized by different product types, and whether it's for retail sale to customers or patients, or whether it's wholesale, and then the different license types. And lastly, we have our license tracker, which is kind of what it sounds like. You can set reminders for different expiration dates for different licenses, different locations, even for your employees if their agent identification badges are going to expire. Gabe kind of touched on that, so you won't get dinged for that. So yeah, you can set those reminders, send those out to your employees, to your third parties, to attorneys, so that you get everything done when you need to get it done. But yeah.
That's awesome. You closed out talking about that license tracker, and that's something we didn't talk about. But you do not want to end up in a place where you don't renew and you realize 2 weeks or a month late you've been operating without a license, because that can put you in a very, very painful place where you may be shutting down operations. You may have to reapply for a license, and as understaffed as regulators are, it could take another month before they approve you, and you're ceasing operations for 2 months, which could mean you can't take care of your plants. And hopefully that's not the case, or you're not making sales, you're not making transfers. And that can just be a huge issue for operators, as you can imagine. So that was an important point, Ileana. Can't stress that enough. Let's close this out. I know we're a little bit over, so I want you guys to give any parting thoughts you have for our audience here. Any tips you may have, just parting thoughts regarding compliance for operators out there. Gabriel, we could start with you.
I think that the reality is it starts with you, right? I mean, if you know your regulations, if you know, it's just about, if you are an individual who is watching, who is desirous of, or who is a business owner in the cannabis industry and who is plant touching, this really does start with you. So I would really, if you're brand new getting into this, read the rules and regulations, get familiar with them, because the sanctity of the license, I'll say it again and again and again, is extremely, it's the most important thing. Without the license, you can't operate. When you can't operate, you're not in business, right? And so take the onus, put it on your shoulders, be prepared to put in the time to read and understand those regulations, and then happy trails. And to Mauricio's point, the regulators are here to help you. So use them as a resource.
My parting words are to overvalue continuing education. You're never as wise as you might be if you attend conferences, symposia, you log on and you listen to discussions like these. You're always going to forget things that you learned, and you're going to misapply some of the items that you may have previously thought that you were applying correctly. So don't be too proud to think that you're so good that you don't need to continuously refresh your education. It's never over, especially in a business that changes as fast as cannabis. Just anytime there's something that's put on by the NHCC, please do join other local chapters, national councils, find a local community college or university that's got a class on cannabis or compliance or whatever it is. You have to constantly be involved. If you're not, you'll lose your edge, and the edge could cost you more down the road.
Thanks for that, Mauricio. Ileana, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, just one thing. Cannabis is one of the only industries where a frontline minimum wage employee can bankrupt or get your entire business closed down because they did something non-compliantly. So, compliance is more than just protecting your license. It's protecting your employees' jobs, your shareholders, all levels of staff, and it's about protecting your brand and reputation. So if one person gets it wrong, the liability is kind of on everyone.
For sure. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you all so much. It's really been a pleasure. I'm so glad you were able to join us. If you all have any questions, I do believe NHCC has the contact information for everyone that was on the call today, so don't hesitate to reach out. We're here as a resource for you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon.